Okay, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the Blether. As you can see, it is just me tonight. Mike is hoping to jump on soon. He is doing a tasting over at Meldrum House tonight. So you've got me just now, and then we're going to be joined by our guest tonight, who is Mark Thomson from Glenfiddich. So he is going to introduce himself. He is not only their brand ambassador, but he is the 2023 Brand Ambassador of the Year from the Icons of Whisky Award, and he is a keeper of the Quake as well, and a dog owner. So proper sound top bloke. So without further ado, let me get Mark on here. Now bear with me, guys, because you know that I don't usually do this by myself. And yeah, let us know what's in your glasses tonight, everyone. Let me know who's joined the chat. Let me know that I'm still live, because last week I had a bit of a problem with the internet, so I'm hoping it doesn't blip out this week. Right. Ta-da! Hello, Mark.
You got me pouring your dram there. Good evening. How are you? Nice to see you.
Good. So yeah, I mean, a small introduction there, but yeah, let everybody know who you are, what you do, and more about you.
Super. Well, as you said, I'm Mark Thomson. I'm the ambassador to Scotland for Glenfiddich. I have been for a number of years. In terms of accolades, I'd put dog owner first, above keeper of the Quake and ambassador.
Definitely.
I put a hell of a lot more effort into the dogs than I ever have into whiskey. I have to say, that's only because of the very nature of those two mongrels that I've got. But thank you very much. A wonderful introduction, and lovely to be along for a blether and a really nice, relaxed evening ahead as well, which I'm looking forward to. But yeah, I've been with Grant's business for nearly 10 years now. It'll be 10 years in December, and worked for a couple of years prior to that with them under contract as I had my own company back then. Some people may remember Spirits Bureau or Dramatic Whisky, kind of an educational program that I did. And 20 years in the industry, hospitality initially, wine first. But yeah, here I am, still driving drams. Not driving with drams, driving drams.
Hashtag responsible. So yeah, so you started off kind of in wine and then created your own sort of whiskey tasting business.
Yeah, I'd been the full remit. You know, I'm like most people falling into this type of industry. Back in those days, it wasn't really a career officer's choice. They just I took a pub job as a part-time thing. Ended up becoming the assistant manager. It was a style bar in Glasgow back in the 90s. Showing my age now. And I became the assistant manager there, and then moved into restaurants, opened Scotland's first sushi restaurant, ran that for a couple of years, and then moved to London. This was in Glasgow, Dundee born, but moved to Glasgow very quickly. And got into the sort of bigger hospitality side, 5-star hotels, bars within hotels, restaurants. And that's where the passion for wine, which I'd already had working in restaurants, once you start to move into that 5-star level, you know, where you've got some incredible chateaus lying around the back of the wine cellar, that's when it really piqued my interest. And discussing a lot of that with the sommeliers and the representatives that came in. Of course, as a young bartender back then, you just think that the limit of your job is pouring drinks on any night, making sure the bar's tidy, restocked. And all of a sudden, you're introduced to this world of advocacy where people want you to talk about their brands in a particular way. And therefore, they look after you, take you out for lunch, let you see the new releases, take you to France, Italy, Spain, Germany. It became quite interesting for a few years, actually. But for me, for some reason, it was always the heritage and the history of these vineyards. Quite a bit of terroir as well. I'm a big trail runner, outdoor enthusiast, and even then, the hills, the mountains, the way they shaped the way I lived and kept fit, to hear that transfer into how a wine tasted was, you know, at 19, 20 years old, was really interesting. And over a few years, that transpired that I was back into whiskey. I was always a whiskey drinker, but never really an enthusiast at that level. Wine was my first passion. I think the biggest problem with wine, and I hope that there's no Psalms on this, you not only need to know about the wine, you need to know about the weather. You need to be a meteorologist as well. You know, if it's heavy hail in spring or early frost in August or September, you're suddenly changing that vintage. Whereas with whiskey, when you make it, it's there, it's in the bottle. That's what it tastes like. It doesn't matter, you know, which year it's from, technically. So I started to switch slightly towards that, and noticed at that time, we're talking sort of 14, 15 years ago in London, whiskey was getting a lot of press. But what I'd noticed was that it still was quite stuffy. It was still a bit sort of heather and weather. And here's your regions, and sit down, and this is the way you must do it. And I just felt, for me, you know, it's sort of early 30s, I was thinking, oh, no, that's not how I drink my whiskey. It's not how I know whiskey either. So I created an educational program, which is just tastings, as you have many tastings around, you know, the world now. But it was an opportunity for people to come down without the stuffiness, try 6 whiskies, and I'd explain them mostly just by category. You know, bourbon cask, European oak, what's the difference? Peated, how does it get there? Dispelling anything about where it's come from. It was more about what it tasted like and do you enjoy it. None of these sort of in-depth tasting notes. There was sort of very top line, and it was very successful. We ended up doing around about 2,000 people a month in tastings across the UK. And it just so happened that my dogs have just come in. It just so happened that I worked with Grant because I'd used quite a lot of their product, whether it be Balvenie, Glenfiddich. And so over time, you really get to know the brands very well. And they decided they wanted to keep me for themselves. And as I say, that was 10 years ago.
So were you doing it kind of before it kind of became a thing? Because we're seeing brand ambassadors very much as like a sort of career now of like, you know, it's, you know, a lot of people about Instagram, everything's very, it's very different now. But when you were doing it, it was more just you forging that kind of category yourself, I guess.
Yeah, Instagram had just come out. It was literally months old when I started Dramatic Whiskey. It was a godsend, actually, because it meant I could reach a lot of people in different parts of the country without spending a massive amount of money on advertising and publicity. It was all self-controlled, if you like. And because it was in its infancy, people who were interested in whiskey, they would follow you because they were interested in whiskey. That's why they used Instagram at that point. Facebook to a certain extent, but it was mostly Instagram, actually, because you could convey how different it was. I'm not, you know, I'm there with jeans and t-shirt and tattoos. I'm not there with tartan and heather and a hairy coo in the background.
You should give that a go, though. Just, you
I
know,
might.
change it.
I might. We had a few funny sort of head-to-heads a couple of times with ambassadors who will remain nameless now. I think most of them have left the industry, actually, who I knew would be that sort of PowerPoint presentation style with, you know, laminated maps of Scotland dissecting areas. And I'd purposely say, you do 3 whiskies, I'll do 3. The crowd get to decide who's the, you know, which whiskies win on the night. I don't think I ever lost. And you know, it's one of these things where you think, sometimes I knew the whiskey the other ambassador was pouring would better my one, but the delivery made the experience of that whiskey better, and therefore I got the points. And you know, I'd say that to anybody that's starting out now: find your own style, don't just emulate somebody else's. Particularly that old style of whiskey tasting. Not taking anything away from anybody that did that. I obviously took over from ambassadors and covered a lot of other ambassadors' work. That marketing in that era back there, from the sort of 90s to early 2000s to 2010s, was there wasn't really a lot of flex. There also probably wasn't a lot of people in marketing who were thinking there'd be a different audience out there that wanted to just learn the top line of things and make it fun. I think still back then there was a hunger, a thirst for that really in-depth knowledge, you know, they get right into the grain, literally, of things, to discuss that amongst themselves and feel that was an exclusive little group of people trying this whiskey. Whereas I just thought, fuck that, throwing it on its head. Sorry. It's one of these, I literally couldn't be any more appalled by that approach to things. And you see most whiskey companies now, they followed that route. Not, I certainly wasn't the first, but that seems to be it's more inclusive. Marketing is changing, although there's a long way to go. I know this, but it's nice to see that at least some brands out there are picking up and taking note of what the audience is about. Cocktails being a great indication of that.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely been a marked change in the last 3-5 years at least. Talking of exclusive groups of whiskey people, we should say hello to everybody that's joined us on the chat.
I just upset everybody on this chat.
No, I'm just watching the numbers decreasing. No, not really. No, not at all. I think we might be quite... I don't know if we'll have all our usual crowd on tonight, because Mike's obviously got his Whiskey Academy going this week, so people sign up to this and he takes folk out for, I think, is it 4 or 5 days, and they go to distilleries. I think they had a sherry dinner tonight or last night. Wow. We go to the maltings. So I see Dave's on. I think, Dave, you've been part of this week as well, haven't you? So you're maybe a bit over whiskey tonight. We have got, let us know what's in your glass, everybody. We've got Rick. Hi, Rick. I watched your Glenfiddich review the other day. Nicely done. Thank you very much. Good review. For anybody that hasn't watched Glenfiddich going viral on Instagram just now, just look up the video of Chris Coates ruining my warehouse. Who else? We've got Annette. Hello, Annette. And who else did I see back up here? And Keith as well. So yeah, guys, let us know what's in your glasses tonight. And I should ask you, Mark, what have you got in your glass tonight?
Well, I kind of thought this would be a long blether, so I've got two.
It could be as long as you like. I've got my comfy seat, so we're fine.
So I did a tasting in Aberdeen on Monday evening, and I hadn't been up to Aberdeen for quite some time. It was a trade tasting, lots of new bartenders up there. And one of the things I thought I'd take along, I always take something a bit different to kickstart the conversation. And we did a comparison between current Glenfiddich 12-year-old and the first time we ever released a 12-year-old Glenfiddich, which might shock a few people. So this is the bottle here that I'm drinking to start with this evening, which is, many people will recognize this. The interesting thing, this green triangular bottle started in the 1960s, 1963. But the first time we ever put a number 12 on it was in 2000, which isn't that long ago when we consider we've been around since 1887. So I've got a Glenfiddich 12-year-old from the year 2000, 2001. I've checked the lot codes that are on the back of it. And it started a really interesting discussion with these bartenders about bottle conditioning, which we poured both together side by side. And to give the context, they are made identically. Pre-2000, Glenfiddich had less European oak, or certainly less vibrant European oak. It was softer, much more second, third use casks that was coming out of it. And what was interesting with the side-by-side comparison there was that we saw this identifiable aroma, not so much on the palate, but certainly an identifiable aroma, which you could indicate was a whiskey that had been sat in glass for a long time. And even now, I've just poured it again. This was opened for the first time on Monday, so it's a bottle that sat for 23 years. And I've opened it now, and just immediately nosing it, there's something in the background there that would say that's not the Glenfiddich 12 we know today. There's a number of factors in there, but there's a second dog just entered the room. But there's a sort of a lot of the guys at the tasting were talking about a sort of warehouse nose. I don't want to use the word musty, but it's an earthy, sort of old wood note that comes from it. There's a bit of tropical note comes out as well, especially when you first open them. And it was really interesting because then we tried the current 12-year-old. And a few years ago, I wanted to explore this further. One of the great things about working for William Grant & Sons is that you can find people who have been around for 50 years in the business and ask them about what happened back then. And it was actually David Stewart. I'd taken along a bottle of the pure malt, which I've got behind me. I'll just grab it because again, that. So this, after the pure malt, the straight malt that came out in 1963, the first sort of big commercial release in the UK was this one here. And it says here, in quite small lettering, over 80 years old. I love this. This is one of the first whiskies I ever tried. Stole it from my grandfather. And he's a big Glenfiddich fan. And I tried a lot of these. And over the years, I've noticed that as you open them up, they have this almost Parma violet note coming out of them. Really intriguing, slight dustiness in the background, but quite fruity and forward. And then over time, once the bottle's been open for a while, that settles and you start getting more of the classic note of Glenfiddich coming out. So I wanted to know what the difference was. I took one of these along to a meeting with David Stewart, MBE, Brian Kinsman, our current malt master, Kelsey McKechnie, who now is the malt master for Balvenie, but back then was just starting with us. She was in the lab. And Leslie Gracie, head distiller of Hendrick's. And we sat around and we discussed this. And I opened one of these from new. So it had been sat closed for potentially 45 years. And I poured a glass of it. And I'll never forget this. David picked it up and he just nosed it and he went, well, it didn't smell like that when I put it in the bottle in 1970. And that's a great reference point to have. But him being a chemist immediately said, but that's a singular example and we have nothing to benchmark it against. And I said, I knew you were going to say that. So I had an old blended scotch from greengrocers in Hoyok called Turnbull's. Again, about sort of 1970s blend. And I cracked that open. It was brand new and new to be opened. Poured it in the glass and I said, there's definitely a similarity between these two. And he nosed it and he says, aye, well, I didn't want to be non-committal. He says, well, the thing you should really do, and again, the scientist in him kicked in, he said, is find a bottle from 2000, he said, because that's when we standardized the recipe. It's not changed since then. So those two bottles, the current 12 and the one back then, would be the ones you would want to try against each other. And then Brian came up with an idea of running both through a gas chromatograph, which will, vaporize a spirit or a liquid and then analyze the minutiae of elements within there. And he said that's the bit where if we saw a spike, because we know what the gas chromatograph shows for Glenfiddich 12 standard. So if there's a spike somewhere else, we could zone in on that and find out what that aroma is and how that aroma is created within the whiskey. Fascinating stuff. We've not done it. that was about 8 years ago. We've still not done it.
I was waiting to find out what it caused.
Yeah, sorry, the cliffhanger. Yeah. So anyway, that was a really long story to say that's what's in my glass tonight to start with.
That's right. It's a good story. Well, unfortunately, I don't have anything Glenfiddich tonight because I am full of the COVIDs. So I went into my piss poor whiskey collection that everybody likes to slag me off about. I got out a holiday bottle because I went over to Campbellton for my holidays. So I've just got a nice Glen Scotia. It'll help me feel better. It's a make you feel better dram. So
I was with the old marketing manager for Loch Lomond and Glen Scotia today. We were having a pint, Scott Dixon.
Lovely.
I'm a big fan of Glen Scotia. I love that kind of coastal, soft, gentle coastal note that comes out of all those. Fabulous.
It's such a beautiful little distillery as well. It's just like, it's just on the street and it's so small and like you go in, it's just like it's like going inside a ship's cabin. You're like, there's no way there's a distillery behind that door. It's just on the street, but it's got so much character. I love it.
I was in it many years ago, and it must have been at the end of a dinner for some reason. And we went, I don't think it was an official tour. We just got to kind of peek our heads in. So I must go back. I'm actually up in Wick tomorrow, and I've got a dinner to host at Mackay's Hotel up there. So I'm leaving Edinburgh very early to get up there. And I posted on social media, and my dad came back to me and he said, oh, Mackay's. He says, your granny and grandpa they had their wedding reception there in 1927.
Oh my gosh.
So, my grandfather lived till he was 106, and I managed
100?
to. Yeah, he was the oldest man in Britain, I think, or certainly Scotland. And it would have been 10 years ago. So he passed away 9 years ago. And 10 years ago, I managed to sit down with him and have a chat with him about whiskey. And I told him I'd got this job as the Glenfiddich ambassador and that, one of the first whiskies I ever had, I'd stolen from him and he had Glenfiddich in the house, and we sat down and had a dram, and he told me about. I filmed it actually. I wanted to find out about his growing up and when he started drinking whiskey, and he's had a great memory, and he starts talking about 1924 in Dundee. And the bars he went into, he says, but there was no single malts. It was all just blends, good blends, he says, but they were all just, he said, I didn't start drinking single malt until, well into the 60s. And I'm thinking, wow, that's incredible. So he could see the change at that time. He met my granny up in Wick and moved to Dundee. So I'm going back up to, there's a lot of family still up there. I mean, they're all dead, I think, but they're up there. They're up there somewhere. So I've got a weekend in Wick going around graveyards.
I still live up in Sutherland, so yeah, it's a beautiful part of the world. My middle son was born at the side of the road trying to get to Inverness Hospital from from Loch Erible.
Did you name him accordingly? Was there a loch next to there like the?
Well, he was nearly called Renal Laguna, but there's frowned upon. So no, I wish I had named him. He was born at Argyll at the roadside. So
I know the boys that have got the butchers up there.
Ah, nice.
Rory.
Yeah, they weren't involved with the birth, thankfully.
Yeah. So I might pop into Coulty when I'm up there, because I've been to Wick a couple of times in my life, but never within the whiskey industry. So I'm going to make sure I can pop my head around the door and see them. Just to, I don't need. I'll say this flippantly. I don't need to waste people's time with a full tour. They pretty much just need to see a still room, a ton room in a warehouse, and I'm happy. Maybe the gift shop on the way out.
Oh yeah, for sure. That kind of brings me on to what I was going to ask, actually, because we had Stuart Baxter on a couple of weeks ago, who the brand ambassador, and we got speaking about. So you were talking about, obviously, Glenfiddich was kind of like your Damascus moment, your over Damascus into whiskey, and Glenfiddich quite often is people's first kind of experience of whiskey, but it's kind of become known as like a sort of like a very well-known single malt. It's like a blessing and a curse. Do people sometimes view it as, oh, I know, but it's Glenfiddich, like let's look for something else?
Yeah, a massive part of my job is re-education. I mean, you can use the term supermarket malt because there isn't one that doesn't stock it. 12-year-old. I think the biggest issue we have is that a lot of people, going back to the references of these bottles, which take us up to the sort of early 90s, people see it as a ubiquitous brand. It's in every corner shop you walk into. It's in every supermarket. It's in every bar. The biggest part of my job is educating people beyond the 12 sometimes. A lot of people come up and say, I'm not a Glenfiddich fan. It's changed now. Go back 10 years ago when I first started with Glenfiddich and you were doing tastings. I'm just thinking of one in particular in Whisky Fringe in Edinburgh, probably about 9 years. Well, it wouldn't be 9 years, maybe 8 years ago. And Balvenie 14 Caribbean cask must have just been released, or something new from Balvenie was released, and the queue past the stand I was looking at was massive. People just queuing up to get a new taste of this. And that's unusual now, even because there's so many different expressions of whiskey out and being released all the time. It's rare to get that sort of stampede. But Balvenie had released something for the first time for a while. I'm sure it probably was Caribbean cask. And the queue was across the front of the Glenfiddich stand. And back then, really, we were only showcasing 12, 15, 18, 21. That was it. There was no experimental series. There was no grand series. It was the core range, as we called it. And I was getting a bit fed up of the fact that the Balvenie stand were emptying bottle after bottle after bottle. They were piling up next to me. So I had a wee break and I took one of the bottles and I went to the gents and I put it into hot water and I took the labels off and rinsed it out and then went.
I'm glad that's what you finished the story with.
I
was like, hang on a second, where's this going?
If I'm honest, the water in the gents wasn't hot enough. I did actually go to a kitchen round the back and get some boiling water and cleaned it all out. And I poured Glenfiddich 12 into it and put it under the counter. And as the queue was standing, I met one of these guys about 4 years ago at the Falkirk Whisky Tasting, or Stirling Whisky. And I said, you want to try some Glenfiddich? And they just looked down at it. Nah, we've tried all those. I said, right, you sure? Yeah, I don't like Glenfiddich. Why not? I don't like the 12. And, you know, that was the pivotal point. I don't like the 12, so I'm not going to like anything after it.
Yeah.
Because they viewed all those expressions beyond that as just older versions, whereas the 15 is made completely differently, as is the 21 with a rum cask finish. So I said, you sure you want to try this? And I pull out the Balvenie bottle, which has no label on it, but they're so identifiable in their shape. The guy's like, oh, special under the counter stuff. I said, yeah. So there was 5 of them, and only 1 out of the 5 said, I'm not a big fan of that. They were really polite about it. I'm not a big fan of that. I said, that's okay. 1 out of 5's fine ratio for me. And the other 4, like, that's good. What is it? And I said, it's Glenfiddich 12. And they go, you can't do that. I said, what do you mean? You can't pour it into a different bottle. I said, it's sample. You're not paying for it. I can do what I want. Ah, but that's cheating. He actually said that. That's cheating. I said, is it? I said, just by taking away the bottle, it's completely changed your opinion of what's in your glass. Who's cheating who? That's a fair point, actually. And I met the guy who didn't like it. As I say, I think it was Stirling Whisky Festival, and he came up to the stand. He's like, I remember you. And by then we had, you know, experimental series and a few under-the-counter things that were just like single cask. And I remember you tried to trick us. I said, well, I didn't. I did try to trick you, but I also tried to make you realize that sometimes what you see is creating an opinion of what you're getting. And 4 of your pals agreed it was just you that didn't. He said, oh, well, fine point. So
there's a lot to be said for a blind taste test, isn't there?
Right. I mean, Glenfiddich 12 is the world's most awarded single malt. I'm just going to get it out there. And that's blind tested. Got IWSC coming up again. And it fits into a category, interestingly, which is non-age statement to 13-year-old whiskies from Speyside. And time again, it wins gold or silver. And, you know, there's something to be said with that. But now, of course, I work with a range. I think we have 29 different whiskies in the world in the Glenfiddich portfolio.
Okay.
So don't give up on the 12. I don't mind when I go to tastings and say to people, I don't mind if the 12's not for you, but hopefully as we go through the evening, there's something you find which is to your liking. And if you walk away from here going, not a big Glenfiddich fan, never used to be, I like that though. That's good enough. That's for me, that's good enough. I
see it all the time with, obviously, the distillery that I work for that I can't mention because as soon as I do, people have to take a whiskey, a dram, because apparently it's over-mentioned on here. But there's our non-age statement, for example, people just judge the whole of our range on that. Oh, I tried that. I saw it in the airport once. It was cheap. Didn't like it. It's rubbish. You're like, right, okay. So, you know, you're just going to judge just based on that one dram. But even, you know, trying a dram one day, you could try it like a week later, a month later, a year later, and you're like, I don't remember it tasting like that. You know, it depends on your mood, it depends what you've eaten that day, it depends on so many different things. Yeah.
Do you know, I think giving up on, let's use the term entry level, giving up on an entry level brand's offering is a bit like going on a first date for the first time and just giving up on dating altogether because you didn't get on well. I mean, you don't do that with dating. You go, yeah, no, I'm going to try that again. There was something not quite right there, and you go back. So, yeah, I don't think somebody's asked me this question before. I don't think I've ever had a whiskey where I've thought, if I never taste that again in my life, I'll be happy. There's been things where I've gone, oh, that's interesting. And you know, certainly if you're in front of the person trying to be diplomatic, oh, that's interesting. But in my head, I still go, oh, right, I'm going to take time out and come back and do this away from a show or away from a tasting. And I'll often say to them, I've got little sample driver's packs, can I grab just 20 mils? And I'll sit at home and separately write out notes and do that whole geeky thing. But in an environment where I know is, I'm familiar with, not the middle of a tasting room, not the middle of a tasting in a pub that I've just gone to for the first time. And I'd ask everybody to, don't give up first time round. And then if it's not great, don't give up on the brand. There's loads of great things beyond that.
Yeah, of course. I think it's that thing of being seen as the expert in the room as well. Straight away, everybody's watching you. It's like, what's he going to say? What's the tasting notes? Like, what do you taste? What do you taste? It's like, it's sometimes just nice to have that moment of like, I'm just going to do this on my own time. And even if you find something in there that you don't particularly like, once you've found that, you can look past it and look for the stuff that maybe you do like, but you can't do that in front of a room full of people that are trying to take notes.
Well, I've been guilty of doing that before, when you pour someone a dram and you're nosing it yourself, and you're sort of, oh, that's and you look around the room and no one said anything, and you're like, oh, I'm sorry, were you waiting for me to take the lead? It's your whiskey. I've nothing to do with what you're getting out of your glass. I'm just enjoying myself here. You crack on now. It's in your hand. I think people do expect, when they go to things with, master classes or tastings, tell me what am I missing, or not so much what am I missing, but confirm that I'm doing it the right way. Give me a tasting note because you're the expert, so that I can feel better about what I'm getting from my whiskey. I'm like, well, don't put that pressure on me. That's not my job. And in the past, I think we've been guilty of doing that as ambassadors, where we lead people. And I just think, if we keep doing that, then that leads people down a path that we want them to take, not their own journey. So I very rarely do tasting notes at sessions now, unless we've discussed it, and then I go, well, look, what I actually get from this, what I get, I make it very clear. It shouldn't influence what you get. If I get, olive oil out of there and you get Lurpak butter, you're right. Because the next time you smell that whiskey and you go, oh, there's that Lurpak butter note again, then you'll identify it. So that's your world and my world. And we can all sit next to each other and we can all talk about whiskey, but none of us need to judge each other on how we're appreciating it or enjoying it.
I think that's a really good point. I always say to people, there's no such thing as a wrong tasting note. I always give the example of, we had the president of the company come out to us recently, and we did a new make session. And I always say the new make that we produce now, it reminds me of apple pie and vanilla ice cream. And I said this to this gentleman, he was shaking his head. I thought, oh no, I'm going to get sacked. Like, I've just upset the president of House and Tory. And he's kind of swallowed his sample. I was like, I wouldn't know. I've never had this. We don't do this in Japan. I was like, that is such a good point. Of course, you wouldn't know what that's like, but to you, it would be like, something that relates to your palate and what you have. So There's no such thing as a wrong tasting note.
Yeah, what I like is the discussion though that comes out of that. So my dad was a mechanical engineer, and I hung around the engineering workshop all the time. And there's quite a lot of whiskies that have this sort of milky, oily note to them, and there's a metallic hint behind it, and it's not quite that waxiness you'll get from something like Clynelish or older distilled whiskies, but there's a sort of milky, creamy. I'm trying to think of examples right now. I can't bring a brand up to mind, but it's just lovely. It's really nice. My tasting note for that, it's not even a tasting note, it's just an aroma, is the cooling liquid in the bay of the bottom of a lathe. Right, so as you're turning metal at high speed, it heats up, and there's a little pipe hangs over that and pours this white cooling liquid, which is a lubricant as well as a cooling liquid. And when it hits the tray at the bottom, it's full of little shards and spirals of metal. If there's any engineers watching, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, or metal workers. That smell is that I can smell a whiskey and go, oh, I'm back in my dad's workshop. Nobody else can get that in the specific way I can, unless you were there when you were 7 years old, standing watching your dad turn a bit of metal, right? So that's a great example of that. But this week, in this Aberdeen tasting I was doing, we were doing Fire and Cane, which is our peated expression finished in a rum cask. One of the guys said, I just can't get anything other than salami. And I'm like, that's really interesting. Salami? He's like, yeah, smoked sausage, yeah. Thanks, I know what salami is. And he said, actually, I can only get that from any peated whiskey. I can't get anything other than salami when I smell a smoked whiskey. I said, oh, that's really interesting. We started having this conversation about garlic and fat and salt and smoke, or air-dried smoke, and paprika and spice and different levels of smoke. And by the end of it, he could still only get salami, but everybody else in the room had joined in. They were like, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, when you talk about it now. And we started to have this massive conversation about different connotations of smoke, different experiences, and spice, and how on the palate, something tannic can come across dry, but so can spice. And when we talk about spice in whiskey, somebody thinks chili and others think cinnamon. They're both spices, or nutmeg, or mace. So we had this wonderful conversation for about half an hour. This poor guy is still, I kind of forgot because he doesn't really like the whiskey, and he was just sitting going,
salami.
Right. I've just got a glass of salami here. I thought that was really funny.
I do find it interesting how people pick out different things in whiskies, but it's what makes it personal and unique to us all. It's why it's, nobody ever enjoys whiskey twice.
It's your memory. And the more you can expand that, the more you can go out and, I was somewhere today and I was out running with the dogs, and I ran past something and I could smell mushrooms. So up until that point, I could just smell dry earth and leaves. But there was a bit I ran past and I thought, whoa, great smell of mushrooms in the air. And I stopped for a while and just had a little I was just glad to stop. Breathing in, and I was thinking, where's it coming from? And the dogs were off somewhere else, but I was thinking, that's definitely mushrooms. There's definitely some mushrooms around here. But, oh, that's quite cool. And off I went. I was thinking there's quite a lot of people probably would be not adding that aroma to their vocabulary. They'd be out walking the dogs, maybe just be chatting and walk straight past that. Or most people actually go out and don't. Let's take, for example, if you walk down this high street and you walk past a Greg's, you could probably, if you stopped, you could identify whether we're doing a steak bake or a chicken bake or a croissant. Right? I would imagine most people on this call could do that. But it's taking the time to stop and think and then log those individual aromas in and go, yeah, that's definitely beef. I can smell the gravy and I can smell the back tones in there, and the pastry's still in there, or that's a croissant, or that's an almond croissant. I say to a lot of people, my job is smelling a lot of different bits and pieces, but then taking the time to go, I'm going to remember where that fits in this. Whereas most people just are oblivious. And then they come to a whiskey tasting and they struggle, or a wine tasting, and they struggle to identify things like, that's so familiar, but I just don't have, it's not that they can't do it. They just don't have that memory recall to go, I know where I've smelt that before. And it becomes a bit easier for everybody to get involved in. But again, there's no, if all you say is this smells less spicy than the last one, but I like it, I'm happy. You don't have to come up with a taste note. If it's, I like this and that.
Do you know what? Vanilla's never wrong either. If it's all you can smell, then just go with that.
Absolutely.
You're not wrong.
100%. Vanilla for the win.
We have got Michael, who says that the 15-year Solera is a fabulous dram. So I was going to ask you about that. Is that still done as in a Solera system that's still in place?
Absolutely is. Michael, I hope you've been to the distillery as well to have a wee nip out the top of it, because although that's illegal, so maybe I hope you've not. Yes, it's still done the same way. Built in 1998 and was filled up with 3 different types of cask. 15-year-old American oak, 15-year-old European, and a small amount of the 15 from American oak gets finished in a virgin American oak cask before going in. They're not in equal proportion. It's heavily weighted towards the American oak, then the European oak, and then this small proportion of this really funky, I've tried it, 15-year-old finished in virgin cask. It's not a dram I would particularly go to if that was sold. It's quite dry, but it adds an interesting earthy sort of spice to the mix, if you like. And the Solera has never been emptied since 1998, so we bring it down to about halfway. It's 30,000 litres circa. I think the vessel itself is about 35, but we don't obviously fill it right to the brim. And then when it gets to halfway, we fill it back up. So it's been a sort of living cask, if you like, but a big one since 1998. And interestingly, that was one of the things I was going to try and do, is find all the bottles of 15 from 1998 through maybe every 3 years, because of the lot codes that we can go back and look at and try them vertically. But the issue there, as I mentioned at the start of the call, there'll be bottle aging in those ones from 1998. So it's not a very fair representation of how that liquid may have developed over the years. We've only had 2 malt masters in that time. And I would imagine the 15 is one of my favourites. Between that and the Grand Cru, that would do me fine. If you said to me that's it for the rest of your life, if you were picking from the Glenfiddich portfolio, it would be 15-year-old and 23 Grand Cru.
I'll just score that question off the book there.
Sorry. And actually, that's the other dram I'm pouring this evening, which is 23-year-old Grand Cru. I'm absolutely in love with this product.
Is that the one that's in the cuvee cask?
Yeah. Well done. Yeah. You didn't mention the C word from the big long French C word, which a funny story about that. We had, when we launched this, cuvee casks are casks that hold still wine, which will go on to become champagne. There's only a few champagne houses use oak to rest those wines in once they've got their sort of assembly of wines. There's only a few champagne houses. Most will use concrete or stainless steel, which is far more economical in some cases because of the scale. You know, you can put 150,000 litres in a stainless steel silo. In a French oak cask, you know, maybe dealing with 400. And this, we got these casks from a broker in France who wouldn't tell us, even if they did know, who the casks came from. And we rested this 23-year-old whiskey in it for 3 to 4 months. And one of Brian Kinsman's things, he loves wine. He's a big wine fan. And he started to look at the influence of wine with oak in comparison to spirit with oak. So we talk about, so we often talk about ex-bourbon cask when we talk about Glenfiddich 12, which is made up of about, the bottles about 85% 12-year-olds from ex-bourbons. And then we talk about ex-sherry cask being the other 15%. But actually, this year at Spirit of Speyside, to prove the point, Brian released a virgin European oak cask, 12-year-old. And it's ruby red in colour. It's fantastic. And as soon as you give someone some of it, they go, oh, it's a sherry bomb. You're like, well, it's technically what would become a sherry cask, but there's never been a drop of sherry in that. That's the wood that's talking. And I often ask people when they talk about sherry bombs, I'm like, which sherry? Well, it's Oloroso. Aha. Oloroso doesn't taste like that. It's nutty and salty. That's not, those tannins, that richness, that leather, you know, when we talk about things like pencil shavings, and that's not found in Oloroso sherries. That's found in the oak that the sherry is rested in. Because the sherry is low ABV in comparison to a spirit, which is filled in at maybe 63.5%. The interaction between low ABV wines and oak is limited. So actually our whiskey is getting a real benefit. There's a slight interaction, but it's not the previous contents that are affecting that whiskey. The only time that changes is when the whiskey has already matured from new make spirit going in at a high ABV, settled, absorbed flavor from the cask, and then is transferred into a finishing cask. Then it's going to take out that first layer of flavor, which might be rum or Madeira or red wine or cognac. That's when it influences. But through full maturation, Brian's asserted that really he's dealing with the wood with a slight change, not the previous contents. And with Grand Cru, those French oak casks are incredible. A French oak is just, I mean, if you've ever tried it, as soon as it's freshly shaved, it's just this potpourri of aroma. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's got quite unusual kind of,
It's a perfume.
Like floral, perfume kind of
funkiness
to it.
And to know that these any influence these cuvee wines or these exceptional wines that are going on to be great house champagnes, and there's a few, you can Google it. I think there's 8, and when you start to see the names of the 8, it's not Lidl. It's the absolute top tier of champagne makers that are kicking about with these casks that are still using oak only in some of their production. And we managed to get hold of them. And being a big wine fan and starting my career in wine, when I first nosed this, I just absolutely fell in love with it. It's that bouquet, it's that floral sweetness, but then there's this abundance of Glenfiddich coming through from behind. The amount of times I've sat down in front of sommeliers and started to discuss things like old white Burgundies, and as soon as you see them pick the glass up, you just go, oh yeah, I get that. So you're not talking whiskey anymore. You're talking about something that's transcended almost above that. That sounds really terrible now I've said it, but it's just such a great example of not only our house style, because that's through and through this liquid, but also the skill of Brian to start looking at casks and going, no, we can deal with these differently. We don't have to be going into bold flavors. We want something that enhances and elevates what we already have, which is great. And at 23 years old, Glenfiddich is bloody delicious whiskey. So how do you go on from that? What do you do to risk ruining that profile and that character? You find some of the most unusual casks out there that are the highest quality and play around with them for a few months. So if anybody hasn't tried Glenfiddich 23 Grand Cru, do yourself a favor and just find your nearest bar that's got it and have a dram and prove me wrong.
I'm going to do that. So it's not part of a core range? Is this part of that?
This is part of the Grand series. So within this series, we have 3 whiskies. We have 21 rum cask finish, Grand Reserva, then Grand Cru, 23-year-old French oak cuvee wine cask finish. And the third in the series is our 26-year-old Grand Couronne, which is it's 24-year-old whiskey, which has been finished for 2 years, again in a French oak cask, but this time it's held cognac. So the interaction between its previous contents and the wood is greater because of the higher ABV there. So Grand Couronne is quite a bold whiskey.
Okay.
The difference between the two, 23 and 26, is unbelievable. 23 is all floral, light, delicate. 26 is bold. I don't want to say aggressive, but it's assertive. It's certainly a whiskey, it's slightly higher ABV, but it's certainly a whiskey where you think, whoa, okay, there's this wants me to take attention to it. Whereas with Grand Cru, I think you try a sip and it kind of creeps up delicately and taps you on the shoulder to kind of get attention. It's like, hey, I'm still here. It was 3 minutes ago you had a glass of me, and I'm still talking to your palate, and that's the way we're going to spend this night. Whereas 26 is like, whoa, what did you expect? I'm a big whiskey. Pay attention right now. This is how we're talking. So I think
we're describing whiskies like Tinder again. I think we are just doing.
Yeah.
I think we need to do the whiskey Tinder.
I'm too old for that. I don't know what you're talking about.
No, me neither. No, anyway, moving on swiftly.
Although my partner and I want to start an app which is called Cinder, which is for the 50 plus. The fire's gone out. It's just a slight warmth there. Just call it Cinder. No one's it's the first time.
You know what? Tinder should just be called I'm bored of my life and I play golf. Also, I work in oil. Just saying. But anyway, moving on.
A geographic specific search, do you?
Yeah, but Aberdeen. So back to whiskey. The experimental range. You've done some fun things with that. I think maybe part of Glenfiddich's success is the fact that you don't mind kind of pushing the boundaries and challenging what people expect of a household sort of supermarket brand, as you said.
Yeah,
I think some good fun ones.
I think we realised about 2013, 14, we started, or maybe 15, we started to play around. Brian's been doing it for a lot longer, actually. Being a family-owned company, when he started as a malt master, he asked for a certain amount of new make spirit in each year that he could just play around with, throw into casks. Some of it would work, some of it wouldn't, but there'd always be learnings to come from that. Mentioning Wick, I was talking to him about fish casks, and he said, yeah, I've tried a fish cask before.
Fish, like barrels that had fish in?
Yeah. Now there you go. You think that'd be quite unusual, but if you look at Scotland, look at all the big fishing ports, it would be very, very common practice to rinse a cask out that had held fish and use it for whiskey. So Portdale will be one of them, Oban, anywhere that's got those big harbours. Because we're Scottish, why would we pay separately for stuff to come into us? You'd be like, you finished using that? Is that done? Okay, let's put some whiskey in there. And I said to Brian, have you tried fish cask before? And he said, yes. And I said, how was it? He said, it was terrible. And then immediately he went, but maybe it was the wrong type of fish. Which, you never know. So he tried a Tabasco cask. Yeah, that's exactly how you'd expect that to go. That's not going to happen. But you learn from these things, wood interaction, previous contents, interaction with our spirit. Does it hold up to the distillery DNA? Is it nice? Full stop. Does it work? And the experimental series, I think, was an opportunity for us, as a lot of world whiskies came in without, when I started with the brand, Japanese whiskey was just rearing its head in the UK as a thing. And I think Scotch in general sat back and kind of scoffed a little bit, going, we're all right. We've got heritage and history. We're not in any danger at all. And then we started to see changes and other world whiskies flexing a little bit by using different casks, coming up with fun things that people were like, oh, well, that's interesting. I like the sound of that. I'm going to try that. I think we were slow at it, not at Glenfiddich, just the Scotch industry in general, of realizing that we couldn't rely on the heather and wither of the past, and that we had to bring things forward. And therefore, experimental series for us was an opportunity to not only showcase skillful distillation, but also experimentation, things we'd done in the past, which we'd never really shouted about. Balvenie were the first distillery to release an official bottle which had been finished in a secondary cask. And that was Founders Reserve back in the 1980s. Until then, you did re-racking within the warehouses for distilleries, but to consciously take a whiskey and put it into a secondary cask and bottle it and put it to market and tell people, Balvenie were the first in the Scotch industry. And Glenfiddich had a lot of firsts as well. So we just thought, yeah, we've done experimentation over the year. We've pushed the boundaries. We were the first single malt to be released outside of Scotland. We've done this, we've done that. We were the first with a tube. In fact, this may well be it, actually. No. One of the ones behind me. We were the first Scotch whiskey to ever release whiskies in a presentation tube. But that's the kind of old thing of marketing. And as these new whiskies were coming to the market, we were like, we've done that. We've got warehouses with that stuff sitting in, but we just don't want to release it, or can't under the SWA regulations. So the experimental series gave us an opportunity to showcase some of the things we've been playing with. We started off with India Pale Ale, which is the first single malt Scotch whiskey to be finished in an India Pale Ale cask. We had ice wine casks with Winter Storm, which was the 21-year-old in the white ceramic bottle. We've Fire and Cane. We did a peated Glenfiddich, and everybody said, you don't do peated whiskey. And we said, we were peated until the 1950s. Oh, were you? Well, we had a malting floor, and we had peat coming in until certainly the 1930s. We were creating peated whiskey. Not because it was our house style. It kind of fell into that, but peat was ubiquitous. That's what everybody used. If your distillery was built any time in the 1800s, peat was the fuel source you used to dry your barley. Glengarry will be exactly the same, right? It was on the malting floor, what are you going to use? And until the rail lines improved around Speyside in Scotland in general, there was no alternate fuel because it was too expensive to truck anthracite or smokeless fuels up to the distillery. So until the rail lines came past, that's what you used, peat. And it's interesting that quite a lot of the Scotch distilleries who are island-based hung on to peat a lot longer because they didn't have bridges. So it was just as expensive for them to get stuff over. So when we released things like Fire and Cane, and it questioned the brand, people were like, what are you releasing a smoky whiskey for? Oh, well, don't you? We were smoky. We stopped being smoky, and then we just thought we'd do it again. Oh, I never knew that. We'd been around that long. Those conversations, Experimental Series helped create. And I suppose as an ambassador, you are just waiting for people to trip themselves up on little things like that. We're like, well, we were always peated. That's just the way it is. Okay, and here's Scotland, and this is the history. So you think you know whiskey, and you're telling me you don't like this, and because of that. So we launched IPA at a beer festival in London, and I remember that. I remember this week actually. It was quite funny. Beer festivals in London, in the East End of London, in Shoreditch in particular. Quite a specific type of beer drinker you're going to get there. And I could see them walking around with their beer glass, maybe 2 beer glasses, and they'd come past Glenfiddich, and I'd taken some Glenfiddich 15-year-old and I'd made it into an old-fashioned cocktail, and I'd put it on a beer pump draft system. So you could literally just dispense out of a beer pump old-fashions, maybe Glenfiddich 15. And these people would come past with their beers, and they'd be like, oh, Glenfiddich are making beer now. I said, well, technically we always have, just we turn it into whiskey after. I said, but we have a beer finished whiskey. Oh, I'm not a whiskey drinker. Okay, you want a little sample anyway, just to see? I think you'll like it. It's finished in an IPA cask, quite hoppy, mosaic, Challenger hops. Once you start to mention the geekiness, and they'll pick it up and be like, oh, that's not what I'm used to. Because they're looking for typical whiskey notes, and because you've mentioned hops, and that was the first thing you got off of the IPA. It was this lovely, grassy sort of hoppy green note off the top. Oh, okay, and they try it. Well, that's quite nice. I said, try it with your beer. It's really nice with the beer. It works quite well. Oh yeah, that's really good. So what's on the draft pump? That's 15-year-old as an old-fashioned. Oh, single malt as a cocktail. Yeah, we're just here to upset everybody today. Do you want to try it? They'd be like, yeah, cool. And so you'd see them walk away with a beer and a little sample of IPA and a little sample of the old-fashioned, and there goes another person that wasn't a whiskey drinker that suddenly is. And it was great for that. And that, that wasn't the main reason, but it got people to reevaluate the brand and think differently about why they weren't a whiskey fan, or why they were avoiding this style and that style. The Experimental Series has been fantastic. And our current release, Orchard, is the first single malt Scotch whiskey to use a Pomona cask, which is basically Pommeau, which is fermented apple juice, or fresh apple juice, fermented apple juice with cider brandy mixed together. A bit like Pinot de Chaude, where they take wine and cognac and marry them together to make a sort of 15 to 17% aperitif.
It's lovely.
It's
really
delicious.
nice.
Yeah, and Orchard is exactly that. It's just a cacophony of appley orchard fruits and floral notes, and it's so deliciously light and makes a great highball. And it just challenges.
It makes a good highball. It's a nice summer garden drink, and Gary here, he's a big fan of it as well. So it's a good price as well. Like it's such an affordable dram that you would just pop it into a cocktail on a Saturday night and not share it with pals. It's just a good shade in whiskey. Yeah,
well, I think that was part of the reason as well. Experimental Series always wants to be accessible, so that you're talking to people that are fairly new to whiskey. Not everyone, of course, people on this call are not new to whiskey, but we wanted to attract people who are unencumbered by the past, by the age statements, by, as I said, the heather and weather. It's just, this is tasty. It's an interesting process. Try it in a highball, and people are not going to go, you can't put single malts in a cocktail. We're like, well, it's not for you. There's 12, 15, 18, 21, 23, 26. You knock your socks off, fill your boots. But this person over here would like to try this whiskey as a highball because they really don't care that it's summer. They just like the flavour.
Yeah.
Great. I think that's the most important thing with a lot of this.
Definitely. I think, do you find that you're still trying to break down misconceptions a little bit that people still kind of rigidly hold on to?
Constantly. Even the lack of appreciation for females in the whiskey industry. It's just, you still at whiskey shows just banging your head against a wall going, did you just actually say that? So I think there's still a long way to go.
My favorite one is, do you work in whiskey because your husband drinks it? I'm like, well, the husband is no longer husband. And no, I work in whiskey because of the husband, just to get me through the day, to be honest.
Yeah. I drink because I breathe.
Or people kind of bypass me in the shop because they spot Mike. Oh, I'll just ask the man though, because I'm getting it from my husband. And quite often it's women. I'm sorry to say, but quite often it is women that'll say, "Oh, I'm buying it from my husband, so I'll ask the man." I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah, there's still a long way to go, I think, for all of us there, and I don't think the marketing of many brands helps. I think it's not to get too political about it, but I think too many people are frightened about upsetting the apple cart too much.
Definitely, if you know what sells, then you're not going to want to risk that too much. But I do see a lot of change. Like, there's some fantastic marketing and branding, and change doesn't happen quickly, does it?
Yeah, do you even like whiskey? I was going to get a T-shirt made up. Because a lot of the shows that you go to, people just rock up and go, "What's your most expensive? What's your highest ABV? Have you got any single cask? What's under the counter?" And I was going to get a T-shirt made up that said all of those, but at the top in small letterings, and "Don't dare ask me for." All the things that you're not going to get if you ask me for them. And we used to have people coming to the stand, especially at the big whiskey show in London. A gentleman recently walked up and he just looked at the whole range. We had a 30-year-old there as well. And he looked at the whole range and he just went, "None of this is good." And I said, "Oh, thanks for your opinion," which I didn't ask for. And he said, "What's under the counter?" And I said to him, no, you see, you don't understand how this works, do you? Are you new to this? Okay, so what happens is we exchange pleasantries and I work out whether you're okay. And then I look under the counter and see what I think I want to give you. And then we have a drink together and enjoy with you. How does that sound? And he's like, "No, is it cask strength?" And I said, "No." "Okay, so here's the next way this is going to work. Go away." Just like... And he said, "I only drink cask strength whiskey. As soon as you put it in a bottle and dilute it, you've ruined it." And I said, "Well, you're in the wrong show, because 97% of this show is approachable, ready to drink whiskies. Very few are single cask strength. There might be a couple kicking about, but the majority are about understanding a brand and exchanging thoughts with like-minded individuals." "Yeah, but what is that you've got under the counter?" I said, "No, I don't think you heard me the first time. Go away." I think I'm long enough in business that I can tell people words were exchanged. But he was just that kind of individual. Like, why have you even paid for a ticket?
Yeah, I've had somebody interrupt me at a tasting that it was like a private tasting for a birthday party in a hotel, and this guy was listening in at another table, and he just interrupted me to say, "I wouldn't bother listening to her. She doesn't know what she's going on about." And I was like, okay, so let's listen to your opinions for a while. Everything he said was wrong. Everything, including my favorite of, well, like the peat comes from the water and it's not even near a peaty water source. So I don't even know where she's getting the peat from there. I'm like, well, luckily for you, I know where we're getting the peat from. So sit yourself back down.
I think we've... I hate to say this whilst I'm being recorded, but I think Glenfiddich have a lot to answer for that, because when we released the first single malt in '63 and sent it across to America, there was a poster that, to put it into context, I was asking one of the family members, and they said in the late 1950s, a 70 cl bottle of Glenfiddich that we would now call single malt, that would go off to become a blend, was cheaper to buy than a blended Scotch. And Glenfiddich decided, let's stop this. Single malt, that's what we want to do. we're going to bottle it, we're going to sell it, and we started in America. Let's sell it to the States. And some of the posters that went out around that time were hilarious, like just hilarious. One of them says, sit down when you drink Glenfiddich, you'll never stand for another blend again. Bearing in mind that Grant's blended whiskey is the founding whiskey of Glenfiddich first, but never went into a bottle that went straight into blends. And Grant's would have paid for that poster and the flights to America and the glass that Glenfiddich went into to cannibalize your own portfolio, to elevate single malt to a certain stature. And I think a lot of brands jumped on that. And if you look through the sort of 60s and 70s, it's very much about being part of an exclusive club. Drink single malt, don't drink blends. Look down on people that do it. Not so much, but pretty much, yeah. There are rules to enjoying single malt whiskey. And if you know them, don't tell anyone else, because you're part of a special club. And this was just perpetuated through that entire process. And I've got so many of the copies of the older posters and publicity from that period of time, not just for Glenfiddich, for lots of different brands, that you're just like, whoa, could you imagine releasing that today? But the rules were established because all these brands were suddenly going, oh shit, yeah, well, if we actually get people to buy our bottle as a single malt, we can charge them for that, and they'll stop drinking blends, and then the money is better because the money's coming direct to us and all this kind of stuff. So I think quite a few, Glenfiddich would have started it, but quite a few of the big brands at that point were the ones that perpetuated this idea that it was an exclusive club to be part of, and therefore, once you get information like that, you pass it on to someone in a bar who's your pal, and then that becomes the fact that it's the water that makes peated whiskey instead of the Chinese whispers of it. The source, the dogs are going to bark because my girlfriend's just come through the door. And there we go. Right on cue. They're good guard dogs, except they haven't gotten off the sofa. They're
so half-hearted.
In their mind, they're like, wait a minute, we're on the sofa in the big room. Let's just bark quietly and see if he lets us stay here.
It's like, go on, burglar, just get out. Oh,
yeah,
never mind.
Don't touch the whiskey or the dog treats. And apart from that, you're fine. Well, that's actually quite good. They've settled back down again. So yeah, I think there's a slight onus on us. And over the years, I think that's why things like experimental series have worked, because we've kind of broken down the barriers to access, made it affordable, done cool things, made people sort of re-evaluate the brand, and hopefully in a good way. I would imagine in a good way.
No, definitely.
It's been quite fun, yeah.
Do you get to choose, or do you get any input into like experimental? I know you got to choose a cask for the Project 20, is that right? Or you got to choose what? You're one of the 20 is what I'm trying to say.
I'm one of the 20, yeah. So Project 20 or Project XX or Project Kiss Kiss, as it's often called.
Oh, I much prefer that.
Yeah. Holly Valance had nothing to do with it. The bottle there, that was an interesting story because it came out at exactly the same time as IPA. But and there gives you a great example of the whiskey market at that time. So Glenfiddich Experimental Series number 1, IPA, went into supermarkets. Quite easy. People pick up a bottle, they read it, it's Scotch single malt whiskey finished in a beer cask. Okay, that doesn't need anybody helping you. You read that and it's done. It's done. When you got to Project 20, it was a completely different offering. It's 20 casks picked by the ambassadors. It's non-chill filtered. It's a higher ABV. There were so many elements to that required explanation, that bottle only went into what we call independent specialist retailers, so whiskey shops or wine shops, where you would have someone guide you through that purchase. They released at exactly the same time, but for very different markets. Project 20, as the name alludes to, 20 ambassadors for Glenfiddich at the time globally, all met up at our annual conference. And Brian asked us to go into a warehouse in... it was actually warehouse, I forget the number now, but it's Conville warehouse number 1. So Conville Moor is behind Glenfiddich, decommissioned, and we have the warehousing. and it's one of the warehouses there. I'm sure it's Confirmore Warehouse number 1. Anyway, we were asked to go in, and Brian just said, write your name on 5 casks each. Right, do we get to try them? He's like, no, just go in, initial 5 casks that you like the look of. Of course, they were still, it's just barcodes on quite a lot of them, but you can see the age, you can see what's in them, but you don't really know the finish. So we thought it was a test on identifying casks visually, because you should, as an ambassador, know the difference between a distillery punch and a hogshead, whether it's sherry butt, a port cask, a red wine cask. You know, there's indicators on the cask that can give you that. So I played it safe and picked 5 American oak casks, because the original American distilleries were still stamped on the side of them. So it's like there's absolutely no danger that's not an ex-bourbon cask. Although the initial one, the final one I did pick was a 60-year-old refill hogshead. Anyway, we the 20 ambassadors end up with 5 cask samples the next day. We're asked to pick one of the 5 that we like each. And of course, we're all thinking we're getting a single cask. None of us are asking what anybody else has got. There's no thought of amalgamating these together, and therefore having a process of recipe. Basically, just, yeah. I remember having the glass and picking it up and smelling it and going, can I talk passionately about this to a crowd? Has this got enough in it? Is this Glenfiddich enough? So by the end of the day, we had 20 casks picked out. 17 of them, interestingly, of the 20 were bourbon casks or American oak, because that probably gives the most classic, modern classic Glenfiddich, if that makes sense. One was a port cask, picked by Beth Havers, our Canadian ambassador, and she saw the casks, 2 of them in the back, big, you know, close to 600 litres, runs over, name straight on both of them. And interestingly, they were both very, very different casks, but a port cask went into it. And the remaining 2 were first fill European oak. One of them actually a first fill European barrel. So it was, our cooperage had taken a European sherry butt or European oak butt and broken it down into an American barrel size, a 250 litre cask. So they were incredibly intense, very dark, very rich. And the 20 casks, Brian took, I can't remember on the day how much, maybe 100 mils of each, and put it into a huge vial and shook it and poured it out. And I do remember him doing this when he poured them into a glass, and he smelled the glass anyway. I had a little taste, and he said, well, that shouldn't have worked, but it seems to have. And it's a bit like a chef taking 100% of every ingredient on a recipe and throwing it in the pot and hoping that whatever recipe that is, it comes out the same way. It's not going to work. Typically you need to take a small amount of this and a bit of that and shape a whiskey into where you want it to go. So the experiment of the 20 casks was a complete fluke. You're obviously dealing with great liquid, of course, it's Glenfiddich, but that you can completely if someone had picked a cask that happened to be peated and put that in, that could have completely messed that whole experiment up. So anyway, 20 casks. We still have that product, and it's ongoing. I think it's a total pain in the ass for Brian, because whilst he said the cask recipe remains the same, the ages have obviously had to change, because he has to try and find the same styles that will end up being the same representation of our original batch.
Yeah, that's the skill there, isn't it? To keep recreating that for you guys.
So I think the very first batch we ever did of Project 20, or certainly our ambassador batch, the oldest whiskey was 19 years old in there, and the youngest was 6. And I had a sample of the 6-year-old quite recently, actually, because I found it fabulously vibrant. It was a first fill. It was a virgin oak American cask at 6 years old, and it just gave everything you'd ever want from Glenfiddich in a really short period of time. But of course, back then, 2016, would we have risked releasing a 6-year-old whiskey as Glenfiddich? No, probably not, because the whiskey world just wasn't quite ready for that. But Project 20 seemed to work.
That's cool. I think we've got a question popped up here from Rick. The experimental series gives the whiskey makers a chance to explore and find fun ways, tasting releases, but do you think that experimentation and constant change makes it harder for consumers to develop a connection with the brand? That's a good question.
That's a great question, Rick.
Well done, Rick.
So that's the end of the evening. Thanks very much. It was really nice.
We've lost internet connection.
Do you know, I can say this personally. When I started properly in the whiskey industry, probably 15, 16 years ago, it was really easy. If you said to me, give me a baseline example of X, Y, or Z distillery, I could quite happily tell you there wasn't a bottle on the market in the UK that I wasn't familiar with or could at least describe where the distillery were playing. Now, I walk around whiskey shows, and even for me, I'm like, oh, wow, there's a new distillery, and I've never heard of it because I missed that email or missed that Facebook post, and I find it quite difficult. So experimentation, if you are someone who is really keen on the industry, that's where it becomes difficult. I think for consumers, we're dealing with new individuals who are attracted to different things. And so I think experimentation is key. When you look at the number of drinkers who drink vodka, for instance, in the UK, so spirit drinkers versus whiskey drinkers, I can't quite remember the figures, but they're vastly different. So experimentation allows quite a lot of distilleries to introduce new consumers to their products. It might not be that they fall in love with whiskey or go back to the core range and start again, but if we look back and look at, I hate to say, a lot of flavored products that came out a while back with honeys or sweetened spices, quite a lot of people liked those. Here's a good example. I was at Whisky Live back in, I'm going to say about 2012. And I was with a distiller from Balcones, Chip Tate, and he just released something called Brimstone. Quite young whiskey, but Texan and brand new. And we were in a very big whiskey bar in London called the Big Easy in Covent Garden. This is going back a long time now. They had still do have a fantastic range. I was standing at the bar, and a young individual next to me said to the bartender, bearing in mind this is one of the better whiskey ranges in London, and the consumer said, "Do you have any Jack Daniel's honey, which had just been released?" And the bartender said, "I'm sorry, we don't. We have 190 whiskies here. We don't stock that." He said, "I can take a Tennessee whiskey, or I can take a bourbon and I can sweeten it for you with a bit of syrup if that's what you want." And I got chatting to the guy. I can't remember what he ordered. He was ordering for friends. And I said, "Oh, is whiskey what you like?" He said, "I'm just getting into it." He said, "But I like JD honey." He said, "It's just really nice. I like it. It's smooth." I said, "Have you ever tried a good bourbon?" And he's like, "No, I don't think I have." And I ordered them, and I remember this. It was an Eagle Rare 10. Wasn't expensive. And I said, "I'll tell you what, let me order you a dram." I didn't work for Glenfiddich at the time. "Let me order you a dram. If you don't like it, I'll drink it, because I do. And I think this is actually quite a nice little bourbon." And he gets it down, and he said, "I've never really drunk it before." And I said, "Well, just think of the sweetness that you've got there that you're looking for in the honey one, but just, again, vanilla, And he picked it up and he said, "Oh, that smells really sweet." And then he drank it and he went, "Oh, that's really lovely. Oh, I like that." The bartender said, "Do you still want me to mix up some?" And he said, No, I'm happy with this. I'll pay for this." And I just thought, there you go. So experimentation is vital for the industry to remain relevant to a larger audience. And I applaud it.
Yeah,
I think
definitely.
it's a bit wild at times, but little instances like that in my head, that individual, if there wasn't for experimentation, would never be even considering ordering a brown spirit at the bar. So Hopefully that answers that, Rick, a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. I think if it wasn't for experimentation, we might not have the new young distilleries and the sort of changes we're seeing in the industry as well. All this experimentation with terroir and with yeast and with, direct firing and everything else. There's so much fun, interesting stuff on the go just now. And I think it just stems from, that ability to push the boundaries and ask, okay, what's next? What can we do? What do people want? So yeah, I mean, it's got to open. I think it opens the door, doesn't it? Keeps things vibrant, keeps things evolving.
Yeah, if you sit back, you become stagnant, not irrelevant. You just become stagnant, and that means you hold on to your core audience who are fans and diehard fans. But I think as a brand like Glenfiddich, I suppose experimentation has always been around. In 2000 we released a 21-year-old rum cask finish. Very few distilleries doing a rum cask finish in 2000, 23 years ago. Very few. In fact, I don't think I can think of one of them now. Prior to that, our 18-year-old Excellence was the first one we ever launched in a sherry cask finish because Balvenie had tried it and then we tried it. So without trying to do that, we would just be stagnant little old brand kicking around. You need to do it, even if it's just to challenge yourself and it doesn't work. Not everything does. Whether that is a realization because of you yourself as the brand or the audience that you're trying to speak to, you learn from these. And without doing that and failing, you just can't survive.
Exactly. Yeah, I think we're producing a consumable product, so we are consumer driven. So if you don't follow what people want, then you become something they don't want or forgotten about. So and it's testament to the fact that you're a family-owned business that's been the same family for 100 years. So it's obviously that you're doing conscientious evolution as we go along.
Yeah. 130 odd years this year, 135, I think, 136 this year.
That's mad. There must be some good whiskey at the Christmas table in the Grant family. I mean, that'd be like...
Well, you say Christmas is a really important time for the Grant family because William built the distillery and on Christmas Day was the first spirit run.
Wow.
Yeah, the family have come back in quite a few times and filled casks on Christmas Day together. So that there's still that ongoing legacy of having casks in the warehouse that were filled on Christmas Day.
That's lovely. Talking of legacy, I can't not mention, I don't know if he's still watching, but Dave Worthington was on, and I have seen your face features on a boutique whiskey label. Like, surely that's up there with better than Keeper to the Quake. Like,
yeah. Well, yeah, let's put it dog owner. face on a boutique whiskey bottle, then Keeper the Quay, then Whiskey Ambassador of the Year. No, I'm being flippant. They're all equally worthy. Yeah, that was a surprise.
That's cool.
I suppose you have properly made it when your face ends up on a bottle of whiskey.
Oh, for sure. I mean,
for the right reasons.
Not a happy scenes man.
Yeah, fabulous.
Cool.
I won't give too much away, but it's one of these lovely little whiskies where we haven't. And again, this is straight from a family member. We don't really do cask sales at Glenfiddich, so you very rarely see. In fact, you don't now see, unless it's old stock, Glenfiddich's bottled by somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, we do the odd undisclosed Speyside, but
undisclosed or teaspooned.
Yeah.
So it's a wee teaspooned malt, which I adore and look out for all the time. Typically, you find them in Europe, so it's really nice to see one in the UK. Actually, there haven't been many, and there's certainly those that have been out there have not given you heavy hitting clues like my face and Struan's face on the label to work out whose cask it is.
Yeah, it's not subtle, is it?
It's not subtle. So yeah, it's a fabulous honor, I'd say. And as I say, I've worked in the industry for close to 20 years, been with Glenfiddich for 10, and there's lots of stories and lots of things. But once you get to, I suppose, that recognizable in the distillery, in the industry, it means quite a lot. It means you've done your job well.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's sold out, apparently. So, I mean...
Oh, really? I hope you got a bottle.
I did, yeah. My dad wants it. My dad didn't get one when they came out, and he's like, "Oh, I really want one with my son's face on it." It's like, you don't really. So we're still trying to negotiate a price. No, I'm
You
not
need to
kidding.
get the print of the label just in a frame for
In
your.
a frame. Yeah, I think he's actually really keen to try the whiskey, so I might have to share. I might have to share it with.
Just the whiskey. Before we let you go, because I know that you were saying that your girlfriend's back, she'll be looking for her dinner maybe, but we have to mention the fact that you've just run this ridiculous charity, like you ran over
Yeah, it was. People watching may or may not know. I like to balance my life out with a lot of outdoor activities, whether it's wild camping or running. I lived in London for 16 years and came back to Edinburgh 6 years ago. And part of the reason I came back was because I was traveling quite a lot to Scotland anyway, and just fell back in love with it. I was ending up on Skye and Mull and up to Torridon. And once you get to these parts of Scotland, in my job, when you're talking about whiskey and you're meeting people and they're sharing stories about the land, and I just thought I need to move back. And I was a runner. I was a cyclist when I was in London. I used to race for Scotland, and I had this whole fitness thing going on. When I came back up to Scotland, I was like, I just want to run for the fun of it, and you can run anywhere. So I'd like to go and see what the world looks like at the top of that hill. And over the years, I've encouraged a lot of bartenders and those in the trade and hospitality to join me, and had a lot of fun along the way in many of the different things. And this year, in August, I put something together called Destination Dufton, which was actually inspired by a journey that William Grant took. He was prospecting for business and had walked from Dufton to Braemar, it's not an easy walk. It's not an easy walk today in well-supportive shoes and rainproof clothing. And to consider he did it in probably a wool greatcoat and a pair of hobnail boots, it was quite an endeavour. It's about 80 kilometres as the crow flies if you take the shallow road. But I decided to do it in reverse from Braemar to Dufton via Tomintoul and make it a little bit harder. So there's a couple of Munros on the way. And then when you get close to Dufton, you've got things, Corbetts like Ben Rinnes and Cornwall Meikle Hills. And to my surprise, when I put the call out to the industry, I had 9 people, actually 10 initially, but one had to drop out, join, all from the hospitality industry. Head chefs seem to be ultra runners now, bar managers, ultra runners. So the day one was 45 kilometres, although a couple of our guests decided to add a bit extra on and did 52. And then day 2 was 47 kilometres. And we finished at Glenfiddich and had a luxury stay and dinner. And we raised £3,500, I think we're at just now. So the link is still open. I'll try and find it and stick it in the chat. And William Grant and Sons will match everything we raise. So we'll double, just to do the math for you. So we're probably close to £7,000. And we raised money for a charity that's close to my heart called Protect Our Winters. It's a really good friend of mine that's the director of that. It's an environmental charity who empower those who are lovers of the outdoors in any aspect, but particularly sport, to be advocates of environmental protection. And she's doing such great work, and the charity itself is doing great work to just raise the awareness of how much the change in the environment is affecting outdoor activities, outdoor sports, winter sports, etc., and summer sports. So yeah, if anybody wants to jump on and put £1 in, it'll become £2 when William Grant and Sons.
That's fantastic. I saw it on your Instagrams. I mean, you make it sound like quite a long run, but you're like literally running up mountains and back down them and through bogs, and it's really impressive and a fantastic charity. Up here in Aberdeenshire, where winter sports, any sort of outside sport, is such a part of our economy, and you see the change in the seasons. It's all just merging into one. So
Yeah, it's one of those things, I think, and also just the land itself. You know, it's a tough one because we're traversing on foot across a lot of that, and you can just see the way that the land is changing with farming, infrastructure, and then the environment and let's say environmental pressures that come on to that. There's so many political things involved in it, but I don't want to get I don't want to get involved in. It was just really nice. It was really nice to have a chance to get people together, and the hospitality industry, I think, need that as well. They need an escape and a break, and we were able to offer that for them. I was really proud of everyone that did it. Of everyone that started on day one, it was only midway through day two that an injury occurred on someone. They had to pull out, but every single runner apart from them made it through, and it was just a fabulously proud moment, you know. So here's to next year, whatever that may be.
And we have to mention your dogs before we go, just because we know they're there. So you've got two, is it short hair pointers or white hair?
Short hair German pointers, also known as purebred idiots, both of them.
Lovable idiots.
They're just 30 kilos of mass that just destroy everything, but they're actually, I love them to bits. I've had Ayla since she was 3. She was a bit of a rescue, and she's now 7. And Angus came to us in January. He's 2 now.
Just a baby.
Yeah, but he's the big boy. He's like tipping the scales at 31, and just they're great. They come out running with me. They did the Destination Dufftown with me, and I thought Ayla would be the one who would struggle, but she just stayed next to me and just trotted along. She's a proper marathon runner, not a sprinter, whereas he probably did 55 Ks each day. He was away and back and up and down and running up to the people ahead of me, and then he was, but boundless energy and great companions. And you know, the industry now are quite accepting of dogs. I'm off to Wick tomorrow, as I said, to dinner to host a dinner at Mackay's Hotel. Dog friendly, so I'm going to make a weekend of it, take them up and run them ragged on the beach. But
you need to come up and see us at the shop, and we are very much dog friendly, so much so that you'll regret taking them because we just won't leave them alone. You're like, for God's sake, would you just leave my dogs? Just
I tend to find that I go into venues now, we're dog friendly, and then the first thing they do when you sit down is come over with a dog bowl and put water down and a few biscuits, and then they look and then they walk away. They're like, I'd like a pint if you've got time. I'll have a pint, please. Thanks. Oh yeah, you as well. Yeah, okay. So yeah, we need to book in another tasting. It was a while ago I did a whiskey tasting at the shop. In fact, probably Spirit of Speyside, pre-Spirit of Speyside, probably 2017. I want to say.
Okay.
A long time.
Well, it's an open invitation, so you're welcome whenever you are up the road, and you don't need to run there either. You're quite welcome to bring the car up.
Yeah, I might. Yeah, so it's a wee bit flat around that part of Aberdeenshire, isn't it?
It is quite flat actually. We don't have a lot of the big hills, but yeah, lots of big barley fields to run around. So yeah.
I know every time we drive past, when I take bartenders through, because obviously I was in London for a long time, and you'd fly into Aberdeen Airport, and then I'd start the chat on the bus. The barley fields that are in there, it's great. I think it's actually really lovely. It's a great journey because you start to see that rise in the geography of that area, and you can see why you could hide a still quite easily around those parts. It's not easily accessible even today.
I know it's such an underrated part of the world, to be honest. But we've got more distilleries, castles, and standing stones than anywhere else. But
I know
it's still a bit of a secret.
Well, we definitely must do something, and I'll definitely bring the dogs up.
Yeah, for sure.
Of course, they only made an issue when I came in here and they started to hear me talk. I wanted to ask a question to those that are still here. Actually, I know that there's been quite a lot here. There was a few things. So the orchard one. Oh.
There's a lot of good chat about the orchard one in particular. I think a lot of people are a fan of that one.
Yeah, what's the smoothest? What's the oldest? Yeah, I'm sure that's kind of exactly the standard of most people's approach when they're new to whiskey. What's your smoothest?
Yeah, exactly. What's the oldest? Yeah.
It's a
But yeah,
pity
no,
Mike couldn't join. He's obviously having a rare old time at his tasting.
he will be. I think he's on catch up today because obviously he's had his academy, which I think it ran over a little bit because some of the guys here are ex-academy attendees and present attendees. So I think today's maybe run over a little bit, and so maybe Mike's just on catch up a little bit.
That's fine. I'm sure we'll catch up for a dram at some point soon.
Yeah, for sure. So, but yeah, thank you so much for coming on and giving us your time this evening. And,
My pleasure. I love these. I think it's a great little opportunity to kind of scratch the head and start thinking about things in the past as well.
I know, it's great, isn't it? And yeah, it's just such an iconic brand as well. It's the sort of thing you get to talk about all day, to be honest, and never really get to the bottom of the stories. But I'd love to see the archive that Glenfiddich must have of all their family history. It'd be absolutely
well, you know, the archive it's all in cardboard boxes in a little hut somewhere, which I'm obviously not going to disclose where, but I've often thought that as well and gone, oh God, can I see the archive? And you go in and it's run by one of my good pals, Andy Fairgrieve, who's one of the best historians I've ever met. And anything about the brand, you know, labels, when I show old bottles like this, he can date or know the territory that went to based on the wording that's on the label, because we seem to have about 6 or 7 different labels at the same time in different markets. And he was the guy who, you know, can go, I know where this was from. Even to the point of the clubs in the crest on the top of the bottles, the Grant family crest, the clubs changed direction at some point, and he knows the year that changed, so he can identify bottle ages from there. So the archive is, I know there's other big companies out there with glorious archives and well-lit cabinets, and we're just a humble wee brand with a lot of history, and most things are just tucked away quietly in a corner. If you ask Andy, once you're there, he pretty much is able to find anything you've asked for, but it's not quite the showcase you might expect. We might have to change that.
It's fine. I know. I mean, I work for obviously the company that owns Teachers, which is one of the best, like, kept, like, they're just hoarders. But it's literally all just in an old room at the distillery with like a tartan tablecloth. It smells a little bit like a granny's armpit, and it's like, it's fantastic because they haven't thrown away anything, but it's not like an archive. There's no downlighting. There's no, it's just stuff people have kept with a wee story and a bookmark tucked in at a page that's relevant, but it's still fantastic.
People often send me memorabilia or certainly photographs of it. I was on a boat. I was doing a tasting in Bergen in Norway years ago, and it just shows how times have changed. This gent walked out. It was a trade tasting. He was one of our distributors out there. And I noticed, he was really nicely dressed, and I noticed his cufflinks, beautiful little dark onyx cufflinks with a gold stag on them. And I said to him, oh, I love your cufflinks. Where'd you get those? He said, oh, these are Glenfiddich ones. He said, yeah, they're... He said, I've had these since, God, I don't know when. And I said, they're fabulous. And they were probably the size, they were smaller than an old penny. I mean, they were literally button size. Little gold coloured rim, not actually gold, domed black onyx with the stag relief underneath. And I said, they are absolutely fab. He said, oh, he took them off. He said, here, take them. I said, I can't take your cufflinks. He said, no. He said, I think I've got another pair somewhere else anyway. He said, please do take them. He said, I'd love you to have them. I was like, oh my God. And I lost them. Of course I did. And I felt so bad about it. I was beside myself because they really were beautiful and subtle. And so I put an alert up on eBay. And I'd taken a load of bartenders to Glenfiddich, and we were having a dinner, and the next day we were having a tour. And I had the current or a pair of current Glenfiddich cufflinks in. And the bartender noticed them. And he said, oh, I like these. And I said, do you know what? I said, if you like them, take them. I've got another pair in the house. In the same kind of vein. And I told him the story about meeting this distributor in Bergen in Norway years ago and losing these 19 1970s, 1980s cufflinks. I said, I feel so bad about it. And we had the dinner and everybody went off to their accommodation. And in the morning, I woke up to an eBay email alert with exactly the same cufflinks in the presentation box, which I bought immediately, no question about it. And I saw the bartender that day and I said, do you know, look, you're never going to believe this. And he looked at the picture of them and he went, oh, can I swap them for the ones you gave me last night? It's like, no, you absolutely can't. Considering how long it's taken me to get these back, no, you can't. And also, they're good, the ones I gave you. He says, yeah, but they're not those. And yeah, so if you can imagine the amount of emails I got on a daily basis with just the sort of every style of cufflink that said Glenfiddich, which over the years, it kind of gives you an indication that point of sale has changed dramatically. It's different from some of the stuff. So yeah, archive, I don't think even have any of those cufflinks. These were, they were beautiful, but yeah, just another one of those instances of serendipitous coincidence.
What does it say? You put it out into the universe and eventually it'll come back.
Right, of course. Yeah.
So now Aston Martin that I lost all those years ago. Just saying universe.
I know. I don't even know where they are. They're probably in an airport security lounge or something like that. It's just something ridiculous. Or a hotel bedroom.
A hotel, I was going to say, it'd be sitting somewhere in a hotel bedroom. Somebody will have them somewhere.
Getting up late, knowing I've got a flight in 2 hours, rushing and left them somewhere. Hopefully somebody's appreciating them today. That's all I care about.
I'm sure they'll be prancing around the world somewhere on somebody else's cuffs. Right. Well, I can't take up your time. I would chat to you forever, to be honest. But
I've had my dinner. If you've got any other questions, I've had my dinner. I've made dinner and then left.
How was you for questions? Actually, I think
you done.
I don't know if we've got any more. Most people are just like saying how much they're enjoying your chat and the whiskey, to be honest, which is fantastic. But I don't think we've left anybody unanswered. Mike's much better at keeping track of questions. I just end up chatting, to be honest.
Well, no, sometimes that's the best way. I can't see that anybody's got. If there's anybody left with any other questions, fire in, because I've eaten. I'm happy. I looked at the last one you did was it Mariella?
I love Mariella.
Who else do I? Oh, we've got a long history from the whiskey industry, and I love to see her doing so well and bouncing around. And Dave Worthington actually as well. Funnily enough, he was on earlier. He's one of these old characters. I don't mean that, Dave. I'm not being derogatory. He and his daughter Kat, they were just whiskey enthusiasts when I first met them. He used to come along to a lot of our events and then slowly just grew into individuals who super knowledgeable and really nice people. And then over time, brands were obviously then saying, could you do a bit of work for us? And then over time, beyond that, they're now both of them working full time in the whiskey industry, which I just love that. I love to see little success stories like that. And opposite ends of the career scale as well. I hope Dave doesn't mind me saying that, but Kat's there, look. There you go. Kat was on. Yeah.
So Kat, we need to get you on the Blether, please. So send me your details, please. Because this is Kat as in Dave's.
Yeah,
daughter,
yeah.
Sorry. Your dad said when we were on the chat that we must get you on. So please, send me your details and find me on Instagram. I'm the Distillery Cat, and send me your details, and we'll get you on the chat if you're comfortable to do that. I'm totally touting for business while I've got you on there, Mark.
Oh yeah, you need to put 4 hours aside though, because she doesn't shut up.
That's fine. Hopefully I won't be all fully diseased by then. I'm very aware of the fact that I'm just...
Oh, you've done very well. You've done really well sticking with it. But I see that the whiskey's helping.
It is. It cures everything other than sobriety. So yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, Dave and Kat were two people that, and you just see great success stories in the industry of people who are just passionate and want to follow that and are not, they're not in it for their own gain. They're in it because they just want to share that knowledge and experience. And yeah, I'm a big advocate of both of them for just being phenomenal individuals out there.
I love that. There's hope for all of us geeks out there that geekery can just...
Yeah, do it. Follow it. I mean, for me, it was more of a career and utilizing the knowledge I had. But for individuals out there now, there's just such a wealth of knowledge and experience. I mean, I find sometimes in not so much tastings, which I'm curating, but if I go into other people's whiskey tastings, I'm just fascinated by the knowledge and the wealth of understanding. And I sit there gooey-eyed just thinking, oh God, I'm getting old now. I've not quite got my finger on the pulse, but I got my face on a label, so I, beat that.
I don't think I am beating that, to be honest, but yeah,
now there's a question came up there from Annette. If you could work in any distillery for a week, which one?
Good question, Annette. So Annette's my colleague at the shop, actually. So
that's a great question. Which one? Where would I want to go? Do you know what would be quite funny? Would be something like Daft Mill, because Francis, I remember going around Daft Mill, oh God, decades ago. I think he'd only produced maybe spirit for 3 years. So that, what's that? He's now on 14, is he? I think I'd probably want to kick about with Francis for a while, just because he's a barley farmer as well. So I'd want to do the whole thing. I'd want to go from field to bottle. I think that would be quite interesting. I once I met my partner Michelle in the whiskey industry. She didn't work there. She was a guest at something once, and over the years when we built up Glenfiddich, slipping the tongue. When we built up Dramatic Whiskey together, I remember someone challenging me on. It was an older gentleman, and he said, "What makes you such a whiskey expert?" And I said, "I never claimed I was one." I said, I'm just talking about the whiskies tonight. He said, "I've been to every whiskey distillery in Scotland, every one of them." And there was a pause, and Michelle turned around and said, and forgive my language, "I've probably pissed in every public toilet in Scotland, but it doesn't make me a plumber." One of the best put downs I've ever heard. And this guy just turned around and looked at her. And obviously, for in the context of it, there was a woman talking. And it was the comment as well. And it just completely shut him down. I've never forgotten that. You don't need to visit every distillery in Scotland. You just need to have enthusiasm and passion and a bit of knowledge. And I think we forget that a lot of the time. So that question is really interesting, because what would interest me, and I think it would be actually the individual, not the distillery. It would be, if I had to work for a week, I'd want to work with someone who's fun to be around and has taken chances and been on the edge. And I think, Daft Mill, Francis Cuthbert, I think is a great example of just doing your own thing. And I think he's probably got quite a few interesting stories about farming as well along the way, which I'd quite like.
I know, I would love it. I was in farming for 10 years before Whiskey World, so I would be geeking out to the max over that. The distillery that I would love to go and hang out is with Ewan up at Dornoch, because he's the biggest geek ever, and he posts nearly weekly on yeast. I mean, I just dig that, like that level of geekery. Like, yeah, go and hang out there.
I'll probably pass through Dornoch on Sunday, and I might nip in to see a few of the guys around that area. But yeah, geeking out. There's a limit I have. I think I just phase out more than geek out.
When the eyes kind of glaze over, maybe. Mike is watching. So yeah, did you see his question there at the bottom?
Yeah, are the Glenfiddich Festivals making a comeback? No. That's a flat no. I think by the time we did, for those that don't know, I started a music festival at Glenfiddich to engage the trade and give them something back. It grew from an initial event, which was 36 people camping in glamping tents at the Spring Head at Robbie Doo, to 1,600 bartenders camping for 2 nights. We realized we're distillers, not festival organizers. So Destination Duffton is following in those footsteps of giving bartenders an alternate escape to appreciate what we do. There was a lot of press and publicity over that, probably more than the festival actually. But unfortunately, the festival is not making a return as much as I'd love it to, because there's very few experiences you can do when you walk out on stage. On the first year, there was 390 bartenders there, and although the stage was massive, 390 people don't make up a big crowd. And I walked out and was completely choked because there was nowhere in the crowd that I didn't recognize a face, and it just meant so much. By the end of it, when we had 1,600 bartenders in a huge circus tent, the lights went down and you might as well have 100 people because you can't see the crowd at all until they turned the lights back on. That was quite emotional. But yeah, I'm glad. I still bump into people in far-flung corners of Scotland, and I'll sit in a bar which I've never been to in my life before and sit down and order a drink, and the bartender will say, "Do you want a Glenfiddich on the side of that?" And I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I'd love one. It's very rare. I don't order one." And then they say, "Thanks very much for the festival. I really enjoyed it." You know, this is 5-6 years on. So it's nice to have built a little legacy like that. Certainly, but no, they're not coming back. Get into ultra running, Mike. That's the way that you get rewarded now.
There you go, Mike. Well, he's got dogs. He's got 3 dogs, so maybe
Dogs are welcome. Absolutely,
yeah.
dogs are welcome.
I can't run with my dog. She's a collie, and she always tries to bring me back. I don't know where she's trying to take me to, but like she just always gets in front of me and tries to push me back again. So I've just given up running with her.
Everybody knows it's not actually very good for you. Running generally isn't.
Just stop. Don't do it. What are you doing?
I fell over last week and it's still hurting. I've got another big run coming up. So we've got a load of friends from William Grant and Sons running the Ring of Steel next week. Which is in Kinlochleven. So we're up that part of the world for a couple of days. We're just all group chatting to see who brings what whiskey.
Yeah, so what's the ultimate hip flask dram then?
Oh, here's another good question. I often find that
you have to pick them in row and pick a dram for your flask.
Well, years ago I had a bottle of a 350ml bottle of Glenfiddich, 12-year-old up Benrinnes. But it was during the Speyside Whisky Festival, and it was one of the 3 years that there was a snowstorm. So I thought I'll run it anyway. And from the car park, it wasn't really that bad. And by the time you got to the summit, it was knee-deep snow. So I buried this bottle of whiskey and I put it in a bag with a label around it that said, "If you find this, help yourself, take it home. Post on Instagram, post on Facebook that you found it, well done." And I posted it up on social media. And no one ever posted that they found it, but the bottle went. It wasn't until much later that I ran Benrinnes again in the spring, and there was no snow. And I realised where I'd buried it, I might as well just sat it on top of the cairn. It was not hidden at all, because once the snow melted, this bottle must have just been front and centre, right in the middle of it. But if I was to, that's a really good question. Where would I be? Well, okay, so I've been to Skye about 8 times with work. And every time I've gone to run the cool-ins, a couple of times with the dogs, and the weather has stopped it. So I've never made the ridge up towards the in-pin, inaccessible pinnacle. So I think that's the bit that I think Skye, for some reason, just because I've been there so many times and started that journey and never made it, and that irks me slightly. So I'd probably be that. And what would I put in my hip flask? I might revert back to Glenfiddich 15. I've found over the years that actually it tastes the same way out of a bottle as it does in a hip flask for some reason. No matter how warm it gets, there's still the same character to it. But if it wasn't that, and it was something to celebrate, I'd probably go for 17-year-old Old Protein. and that's because it just reminds me of my gran. So if I'm thinking family and achievements, I think that might be the one. Of course, they don't make it any longer, so it's harder to get in a hip flask, but
even more special then.
Yeah,
he definitely be leaving that one at the top of the hill.
It's going back to that whole thing of that salty coastal note. I grew up in Dundee and spent many years on those kind of pebbly beaches on the east coast where you get that briny note in the air and the sand dunes behind you. And I think a lot of those whiskies like Pulteney and Blether, when they're in just American oak casks, that just sings of that. And that's why I love things like Grand Cru. You've got that salinity coming through, the lightness, the perfume, the floral notes, but it's the grassiness in there as well. So I think I'm a bit of a sucker for a really simple spirit, but that has a sense of place. No doubt about it.
That's why I love Kilchoman is my kind of go-to, because it just reminds me of living on. I used to live on a very small island off the southwest coast of Oban, and it just that kind of grassy, kind of farmy sort of coastal PE just reminds me of living on the west coast. Just
what island was that?
Isle of Ling. So you go across. Have you heard of the Isle of Seal, with the bridge of the Atlantic? It's got a little humpback. Yeah, so you cross Seal, and then the ferry departs from Seal. So you can either go to the south end of Seal or the north end of Seal. South end's over to Ling, north end you go over to Easdale. So most people have heard of Easdale.
Yeah. Is that the stone skimming place? No.
Yes, that's why people.
Yes, sorry. Yeah.
They get all the publicity.
Yeah.
So so we were kind of along from Easdale, and you could see Judah from us next to Reeducation, where the big whirlpool. Yeah. So that's where I was.
There's an island come up for sale up there actually. It's not Torsail. Is it Torsail? One of my colleagues, Fabs, he spends summers on there. There's one house. It's 250 acres and it's quite a flat island, and you have to row over or get a boat with a motor. There's no ferry, and it's up for sale at the moment. He did a little reel about otters on it, and he loves the island, but it's gone up for sale for quite a massive amount of money, and I think he's trying to crowdfund it or get some kind of funding to buy it, so it's not just taken over in loads of Airbnb.
We had there's a little island next to Ling called Torsa that you go across from. It's Torsa for sale. Oh my god! Right, well, put me in touch with your mate, because me and him are going halves. Like,
it's 1.5. It's 1.5 million they're asking for it.
He might have to put in a bit more. To be fair.
I said to him, we could make it a cooperative, but there's no hills, so I'm not interested. It's literally a 3-bedroom farm cottage and 250 acres of land. That's it, and it's flat.
That farm. Yeah, so we used to. There's a causeway, so we used to walk cattle and sheep across there for the grazing. But the cottage, it was on what do you call it, the B&B, Airbnb. But it used to be booked up like years in advance. Like, it was always just fully booked out, because it comes, if you book into the house, you get like the use of a little dinghy, because you have to row on to Ling and then obviously go off of Ling onto the mainland from the ferry. So it's not easy, but it's
well, it's up for sale. He's stayed on it for a couple of weeks at a time, and if you go and see Fabsynth, as in absinthe, but FAB. Fabsynth, he's got a phenomenal little piece on his Instagram about the otters on that particular island, which he's trying to protect. And he is the guy that filmed all the stuff for Destination Dufton and created all the promo videos. And he's just a fabulously talented, disgustingly talented individual. But he's also a big guy about nature and just protecting all this kind of stuff and little parts of the world that we would otherwise forget about. So it's up for sale. So maybe we could just all get together.
Yeah, like if you get like down the back of the sofa and get your loose change out, let's all just club in together. We've got Callum Fraser saying hello to you there, Mark, as well. So
I know, I saw that. Good evening, Callum. How are you? Nice to see you.
Amazing. Small world, isn't it?
It
smaller and smaller the more you speak to people.
I know. Well, shall we call it a night now? Because that's a couple of hours. That's a good couple of hours.
That is all my children returning home as well, so I better go and make sure I've got all 3 But, you know, 2 out of 3 I can work with it, and we're still winning. But yeah, if there's only one, then I better do something about it.
Well, I hope you feel better, and thank you for powering through.
No, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. Honestly, we could speak to you all day, and we'll definitely get you back on, and we'll get you up to the shop. But I'll let you if you just hang tight for 2 seconds, and I'll say chitty with you properly. I'll just say goodbye to the guys, and then I'll end the chat. So yeah, thanks very much everyone for tuning in. Sorry Mike didn't make it, but thanks for sticking with me. Next week we have an undisclosed person because I've messed up the dates. So surprise, we'll see who's on next week. But yeah, we'll catch you again, guys. Thanks very much. Bye for now.
Thank you all for joining. Appreciate it.